back, Chappelle. Welcome back to not welcome back. This is actually your very first flip. Oh my God, baby's first flip. Now, the big thing about it is, this is your very, very first flip, and this right here, the thing we're sitting in right now, is your flipped classroom, right? Okay, so like as you know, you found this on my YouTube channel. Remember, if you're watching this right now, you should be in either my B period, my C period, or my E period. If you're in my G period honors, you are on the wrong flip, right? Remember, always B period, C period, E period. Y'all are watching West Civ flips, WC flip number, blah, blah, blah. Never do one that says honors, never do one that says AP. If it says HNRS in front of it, don't do it. If it says AP in front of it, don't do it, all right? But the big thing about it is like I absolutely loved meeting all of you today. It was actually absolutely fantastic to be back at school again. I always love the first day of school. It's always like still gives me the same like butterflies and nervous feelings every single year, even though I've been doing this for a lot of years now, right? But the big thing about it though is that we are now starting your very first flip, right? Your very first flip in your very first flip classroom, and this is going to be a nightly thing, right? Where you watch these videos and you take your notes and you go over all your stuff, and then tomorrow you'll come into class, or maybe in 2 days, depending on like when you're watching this, but you're gonna actually come in the next class and you're gonna have a warm-up, right? We're gonna listen to a couple songs, and then you're actually going to answer the questions from this stuff, right? See, hence flipped classroom. We're flipping it around, right? Now, the big thing about it, though, is we got to start at the very beginning, right? What the heck are we talking about in the very first flip? I know we gave us homework the very first night. Calm down. Now, anyway, so big thing about it, though, when we're looking at it, welcome to Western Civilizations, right? That is the name of this class. This course is known as West Civ for short. The big thing about it, though, in general, is before we can go any further and before we can really do anything at all, we need to break that word down, right? What the heck does Western Civilizations even mean? What are we talking about in this class, Mr. Terry? What are we getting after? What are we going into? What are we doing? Well, the big thing about it is, let's break it down into two parts, right? So Western, to start off with, refers to a cultural split between societies, okay? Now, typically in a modern historical sense, when we are referring to different cultural sets, we talk about either Western or Eastern or one of the two that are like maybe a civilization that doesn't fall into those two categorizations. But the big thing about it, though, is Western usually refers to any society that has cultural roots around the Mediterranean Sea and or originates pretty much out of Europe, right? Now, the biggest thing about it is that's what we'll mostly be talking about in this class. It's mostly a European history course, and then also delves into how the Europeans and how the growth of their societies affected other people as time went on, right? We'll discuss how Europeans affected Africa in their colonization and also during the transatlantic slave trade. We'll discuss how Europe affected Asia and Latin America during the eras of exploration and also during the areas of imperialism and then also exploration as well. But the big thing about it, though, is Westerners are usually referred to as those Europeans who started in small ancient societies that originated around the Mediterranean Sea, right? Now, the Mediterranean Sea being that big body of water between Africa and Europe that actually surrounds like places like Italy and is to the south of France and then also Spain, right? So like in a bunch of other places we'll get into and everything like that because the whole unit starts in the Balkans. Now, the big thing about it, though, getting into it, now what does civilizations mean? Well, a civilization refers to the concentration and sedentary societies formed after the end of the Paleolithic period. Now, there's a couple words in that little definition right there that some of y'all probably have no idea what it means. Like, for example, the word sedentary, which is in all capital letters, which means you should probably highlight that bad boy because it's going to be very, very important. What sedentary means is they don't move around, right? They stay in one location, okay? They actually have a city or a village, and they stay in that area throughout the entire year. Now, a lot of historians will get into this big stuff and be like, oh, if you're about to talk about the origin of human societies, you have to talk about how early civilizations were not completely sedentary. Calm down, all right? So, like, now, the big thing about it, though, in general, is all you really need to worry about is that word sedentary means that they're not moving around. And the other thing that you don't know what means is the word Paleolithic. We're about to get into that here in about, like, 2 seconds, right? So the big question about it is, we're talking about Western civilizations, and where do we start, right? So, like, when do we start? When? Where in time are we beginning this entire course? Well, the big thing about it is, I love a good metaphor. I love a good metaphor. I love, like, a really, really good symbol that we can use to interpret time and stuff like that. The hard part about trying to study Western civilizations is the fact that it's such an expansive period of time. And the other, the even harder thing is discuss how do you begin Western civilizations because human history is several 100,000 50,000 years long. The thing about it that you need to also understand is that the history of the planet is also extremely wrong, and we are irrelevant to the grand scheme of things, right? If you were to look at the history of the Earth, the planet Earth, as if it were a football field, right? Like as if it began right here on the 1 yard line and went all the way over to the opposite 1 yard line, right? If those 100 yards were a history of the 4.5 billion year old planet, let's say that again, 4.5 billion years old planet, how much space on this thing do you think human history would take up? That's a really terrible guess. All right, so no, I'm just playing. All right, so the big thing about it is some of you are like, well, I don't know, maybe about 40-yard line down or maybe 20-yard line down. And I love this analogy or this metaphor anyway. It's an analogy, it's a metaphor. I love this metaphor as Earth's time as a football field due to the fact that it's got all these nice little lines and markers, right? It can kind of actually break everything up for you in a visual sense. Well, the thing about it is human history is so tiny in the grand scheme of the timeline of Earth, it would only take up about the width of a Christmas light at the very, very end of the football field going into the opposite end zone, right? So if this right here is the present, only the width of the light of a Christmas light, okay, is about how much time humans have been on this planet. And here's the even crazier part, y'all. Since we've made civilizations and all this other stuff, it's only the width of one of the last blades of grass, right? That's how literally irrelevant human beings are to the history of the entire planet. Now, we have a huge effect on the entire planet, as we already know, when it comes to a lot of different things that you'll see in society today. But the big thing about it, though, is then where did we start? Then where did human being comes from? If it was 4.5 billion years, all of that, and then human beings are right there, then where do they show up at? Well, the origin of human beings really, really lies in the idea of the origin of hominids, right? Hominids are any kind of modern-day human being that you could ever think of, and that actually goes over back several 100,000 years, starting off with Australopithecus, Homo habilis, and then Homo erectus and stuff like that. But hominids, okay, are the earliest form of human beings, right? We actually have remains of some of these early hominids, where they came from and stuff like that, and we'll talk about all that stuff here in about 2 seconds. But the earliest modern human being that we know of is that of Homo sapien, right? Homo sapien is what we are, right? We're technically Homo sapien if you want to really, really, really break it down into a certain subspecies group. But the big thing about it, though, is Homo sapiens, modern-day humans, the things that are this right here, right? All of us right now, we originated about 300,000 years ago, right? And everyone originated out of the continent of Africa, right? Now, we believe all human beings started out on the continent of Africa. Our earliest human remains that we've ever found are on the continent of Africa, and the big thing about it is we've even named some of them. One of the oldest remains of human beings ever found was actually a skeleton in sub-Saharan Africa, and they named her Lucy, right? And she actually would have been very, very short, and also was a primitive human being, and also had some different genetic tendencies, but we believe that she was what we refer to as an Australopithecus, right? Now, Homo sapiens, on the other hand, though, right around 200,000 years ago, began to start migrating out of Africa. Now, this is the theory known as the out of Africa theory, and it actually means that human beings then began to migrate slowly over time due to climatic changes, continental shifts, stuff like that, and eventually move throughout the entire planet, right? Now, of course, as you can see, Native Americans and then some of the Mesoamericans ending up there a little bit later. Now, the thing about it, though, as well, is that that's not necessarily proven, but the big thing about it, though, in general, is it's the leading theory behind the movement of people out of Africa, right? Now, when you're talking about the movement of people out of Africa and human time and human history in and of itself, you also have to understand that there are two major chunks to human history, all right? Two distinct time periods. And look, this is how much it all takes up. Look at how much all the old stuff is, and the new stuff is only very, very small, right? And we are living in this era right now, okay? So the thing about it is, what is that old period called, though? Well, it's referred to as the Paleolithic period. Now, that's that word that was underneath civilization a little bit earlier that you might not have known, okay? What Paleolithic means, it means if you break the word down into its basic parts, Paleo and lithic, it literally translates into the word Old Stone Age from Latin, right? Lithic meaning stone, and paleo meaning old, right? Now, you've probably heard this word paleo bounced around in society a little bit every now and again. Paleo also refers to kind of the old way of doing things. There's a diet called paleo where people don't cook things very, very much, and it's kind of the old way of eating. Now, the big thing about it in general, the Old Stone Age encompasses nomadic hunter-gatherer societies. So we're talking about people that actually moved around constantly to find their food, right? Now, again, see that what I'm talking about back in that definition where it said civilizations. It talked about sedentary societies that started after the Paleolithic period. So the Paleolithic period was defined by people that were not sedentary. They moved around constantly to find their food, and that's what made them nomadic, or they were nomads, right? And a hunter-gatherer society is how they operated. A hunter-gatherer means that they would literally go around and they would hunt for their meat. They would gather natural resources that they could find. Now, the interesting thing about the gathering component has to do with the fact that they were not growing these things, okay? It actually has more to do with the fact that they were finding natural resources, right? Finding edible plants and stuff like that they could actually use. The other interesting thing about the Paleolithic period is that there was a gender division of labor. We believe that men in these Paleolithic societies had certain jobs, including hunting and things like that, tracking movement of like the movement of the villages and stuff like that. Well, not villages, of the settlements. And then also the gender division of labor included women, which would actually be much more for child rearing, and then also the gathering component, right? Now, the interesting thing about this gender division of labor in Paleolithic times is that there was an equality amongst the genders, right? Men needed women just as much as women needed men, right? Because like men had to go out and do this to keep everyone alive, and women had to do this to keep everybody alive. So there was an equality, an egalitarianism, if you will, right? But it also, though, these gender division of labor societies, these Paleolithic people led to the origin of language. We believe that the origin of language came around through hunting, right? Because we actually think that men would go out in hunting parties, and they learned language because they had to communicate with each other silently using like sign language or nonverbal signals, and then later on it turned into verbals and like pointing at certain items, giving them names and stuff like that, and that's the origin of language, is hunting, and actually these early like nomadic, these gender-divided nomadic hunter-gatherer groups. And then also we saw the signs of early religion, right? Now, early religion could be seen because what happened was they started burying their dead. Now, this is an interesting thing. Human beings began to bury their dead. We believe some of the oldest known burials that we've ever found are pretty close to like 20,000 years old bodies, right? And they not only were buried, but they were buried with certain items that were precious to the person that when they were in life. Like for example, today you learned that I love having a football in class, love throwing it around and stuff like that, love asking questions, love doing all that. But the big thing about it though is if I were to be buried, if I were to be buried in an ancient society, I'd probably be buried with this football because the idea is that it was close to me. And then that probably denotes that we believe that Paleolithic people did believe in an afterlife because of that burial of the dead, right? Now also the other big thing is we even saw some early signs of art, right? So like we, for example, saw these things known as cave paintings. So during the Paleolithic period, we're seeing people advance and we're seeing societies grow, right? Now, what happened right here, though, that turned this gray thing into this red thing? Why aren't we living in the Paleolithic period anymore? And if we're not living in the Paleolithic period anymore, then what period are we living in? Well, I'll tell you. That's a really, really great question. Well, what happened here, okay? Well, it has to do with the invention of farming, all right? Now, in 8000 BC, which is very recent in like the grand scheme of history and stuff like that, again, this point right here, this 8000 BC point, is about as wide as a blade of grass on that football field when we're talking about like the history of the planet. But when farming was invented in about 8000 BC, so began what was known as the Neolithic period. Of course, just like the Paleolithic, paleo meaning old Stone Age, Neolithic means new Stone Age, because neo in Latin means new, or like not, or like brand new, all right? So, and the big thing about it is lithic, of course, means stone. Now, the thing about it, again, going into it, though, this period of time or this event is also known as the agricultural revolution because literally farming was invented. That was the key thing. The invention of farming is massively important because it made it so people did not have to move around as much, right? That's why it's such a huge deal. Farming requires you to be sedentary because you can't get up and leave your crops. They must be tended to, right? You have to actually keep them watered. You have to keep them irrigated. You got to keep them weeded. You got to keep them right so they stay alive. And so they actually provide foodstuffs for your people. So the thing about it is, farming is such a huge deal because it literally turned people from being nomadic hunter-gatherers into sedentary civilization-style societies. Without farming, we would not have the history that we have had now. Not only is farming that important that it led to the growth of civilizations, but it also went towards a bunch of big positive outcomes, including plant and animal domestication, right? Which includes the fact that that means that they literally started domesticating plants and animals, right? We have animals that live in our homes now because they have been domesticated. That's what that word domesticated means. The dog that you may be looking at right now while you're doing this flip is a domesticated animal. And they're descendant of wolves that were actually domesticated some give or take what we believe, some 7,000 to 6,000 10,000 years ago, right? We'll talk about that a little bit in class and stuff like that, but they also domesticated plants. That means that they actually took certain plants and replanted them because they had certain attributes that humans could use. Now, I'll talk about that a bunch in class. I love talking about plant domestication because it's genius, because we're basically all eating mutants and stuff like that, which is a whole other thing. Now, going into it, though, in general, that also plant and animal domestication, if we're not just like domesticating dogs, we're also domesticating cows and food animals, right? Pigs, chickens, stuff like that. And that is going to lead to what's known as a surplus, right? Now, surpluses were extremely important in ancient societies because it meant that they had enough food laying around and enough food produced that they could survive harsh seasons and make it all the way through the winter and stuff like that. Village and concentrations are going to be really big. As people begin to actually learn to farm, they're going to start staying in one place, and these settlements will begin to grow, right? Exactly, okay? So all the biggest cities in the world that you know of right now all are originated and started out from very small settlements, right? Settlements always start small, and then they grow over time. Well, that's going to happen following the Neolithic Revolution as well. Specialized jobs is going to be really, really big as well, because if you have certain people farming, and it means you don't need everybody farming, and if not everybody's farming, what's everybody going to do? That's going to lead to job specialization. You're going to have artisans and craft workers, blacksmiths, weavers, cobblers, people that make shoes and clothing. So job specialization is going to grow out of this invention of farming. Trade is also going to grow as certain civilizations can grow certain things, and then other civilizations of maybe a couple hundred miles away can grow other items or specialize in the domestication of different animals. They can start to begin to trade those different items, okay? And then also writing is going to be in a big origin as well, because you have to keep track of all this stuff. For example, looking at this thing right here, that right there is ancient Egyptian writing, okay? Those are hieroglyphics. Well, writing has its roots in plant and animal domestication and in farming, because the earliest writing systems were actually number systems, so they could keep track of how much was being grown, how many people they have, and how much they need in that surplus to survive those harsh seasons, right? And then also, of course, as you can see right here, art is going to begin to grow and expand due to the invention of farming. Now look at all those positive outcomes, all those amazing things that came just from the simple invention of farming. Now, but if there's positives, are there negatives? Yes, there are negatives. If you actually ask, especially one of my favorite evolutionary biologists / historians by the name of Jared Diamond, for any dad that's listening to this right now, he also wrote a book called Guns, Germs, and Steel, which is very, very famous, and a book called Collapse, and they're very, very good. Highly recommend. Now, the big thing about it, though, in general, is Jared Diamond says the worst invention in human history is hands down got to be the invention of farming, because it led to things like this, right? Okay? He says that the invention of farming led us down a path of advancement that we far exceeded our own grasp, right? Now, the negative outcomes of farming can also be boiled down into basically societal issues, right? So, for example, social differentiation, okay? Social differentiation refers to the fact that we now have social classes, right? There are certain people that are believed to be more important than other people. Wealthy people being believed to be more important than non-wealthy people or poor people. There are the haves and the have-nots, okay? There are the rich, the poor, and the people in between. Social differentiation did not exist in nomadic hunter-gatherer groups because everybody was of the same rank, okay? Now, some people would argue, well, what about chieftains and tribal leaders? Well, yeah, but those were usually just elders and things like that basically just kept old stories, retold them, and or settled any kind of dispute. But it was still very egalitarian societies from what we understand. Now, economic inequality, of course, relating to social differentiation is going to occur. Another couple of big things as well is going to be poorer nutrition. I know some of you are like, why aren't you going in order? But calm down. So the big thing about it, though, is poorer nutrition is going to also be as a result because we eat way too many carbs now. We're not supposed to eat this many breadstuffs as we do. But also, the bigger thing about it is, in the long run, we're also going to eat a heck of a lot more protein, and the protein is going to lead to brain development and stuff like that. So, that's not, we'll talk about that stuff a little bit later on. But the two biggest ones on this list that always stand out to me more than any other one are disease and the loss of women's rights, okay? Now, disease is going to be a really, really big one because we'll talk about this tomorrow in class as well. You're going to see the growth of bacterial and viral infections due to the actual, the creation of farming. Mostly due to the fact that human beings are not meant to be around animals as much as we are. But what's going to happen over time is a lot of viruses and bacteria that actually could affect animals but maybe not necessarily kill them are going to mutate just enough to jump onto human beings and then affect us, right? Some common things that you've heard of before include the common cold, the flu, tuberculosis, several other different diseases that originally came from animals that eventually mutated and gravitated towards humans, right? And we wouldn't have been around those animals all the time had farming not been a thing. Now, the big thing about it, though, also is the loss of women's rights, because remember, in Paleolithic societies, the jobs and roles of women were the gatherers, right? They were the ones that went out and found and harvested certain vegetables and foodstuffs and things like that. But when farming came along, it took that job away from them, leaving them basically to be sedentary people that were in charge of child rearing or other like smaller things. But a lot of historians believe that the loss of women's rights is related to the creation of farming. Now, the big thing about it, though, is that over time, you don't necessarily need to write this down at the very, very top. It's just kind of a little like organizer or whatever that can help you out. But villages that are going to be created following the Neolithic Revolution are going to turn into towns. Those towns will eventually grow into cities, and the cities will eventually grow into civilizations. Now, biggest thing about it is what is the characteristic of a civilization? Well, there are 6 characteristics of a civilization. If you have a civilization, that means you have concentration, which means everybody lives in one place. You have complex religious structures, which means that religion is going to grow out of this like invention of farming as well, but a very, very complex one that includes priests and like different kinds of ceremonies and sacrificial practices in some places, and then also a lot of it is going to be related to their farming as well. We'll talk about that a little bit more tomorrow also. Now, political and military structure, because if like you have a civilization and they have a civilization down there, you may end up going to war with each other, right? Social classes are going to pop up, writing, art, and intellectual activity, which we've talked about a lot of this stuff already. Now, the thing about it, though, is can any of you name some of the earliest civilizations? That right there, of course, being Egypt. There were tons of this different stuff. For those of you right now that were like, Mesopotamia, very, very good job. Mesopotamia is exactly right. But then there are also the Phoenicians and a lot of other ancient societies. But the big one that we start off with in this class is the first Western civilization when we talk about ancient Greece. So we're actually going to start talking about ancient Greece tomorrow in class. But I'll see y'all then. Y'all have a great one. Hope you enjoyed your first flip. See y'all soon.